To the president and his advisors, human rights concerns can be an impediment to the flow of commerce between countries and a barrier to beneficial partnerships for the United States. In their view, trade equals jobs and prosperity, and concern about human rights too often backfires, getting in the way of efforts by the United States government to increase all three. As they see it, the big mistake that President Barack Obama made was to publicly shame countries rather than to first build working relationships based on common interests. Only then, they say, can the president privately raise human rights concerns. Aides point to Mr. Trump's success in persuading Egypt's president, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, to release an American aid worker. Mr. Tillerson outlined the approach during a speech this month to State Department employees that distinguished between American values and American interests. If we condition too heavily that others must adopt this value that we've come to over a long history of our own, it really creates obstacles to our ability to advance our national security interests, our economic interests, he said. It doesn't mean that we don't advocate for and aspire to freedom, human dignity and the treatment of people the world over. We do, he added. But that doesn't mean that's the case in every situation. In Iran's case, pushing on human rights is an easy decision since the Trump administration sees little cost. Iran has emerged as one of the top 2 or 3 foreign adversaries of the new president, and he is not seeking economic or security ties with Tehran that could be jeopardized. In Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, Mr. Trump sees an economic partner and the anchor of a Sunni Arab alliance to counter Iranian influence in the region. He announced $110 billion in arms sales to Saudi Arabia on Saturday as well as billions of dollars worth of business deals. But the Saudi human rights record is no better than Iran's. By some measures, it is worse. Iran just completed an election for president, albeit a flawed one, for an office subordinate to the theocratic supreme leader. Saudi Arabia is ruled by an absolute monarchy that does not meaningfully share power or even allow women to drive. The latest human rights report produced by Mr. Tillerson's own department mentions Saudi Arabia's restrictions on universal rights, such as freedom of expression, including on the internet, and the freedoms of assembly, association, movement, and religion, as well as the country's pervasive gender discrimination. Raif Badawi, a writer, has been in prison since 2012 after starting a blog called Free Saudi Liberals Network. Freedom House, an advocacy group based in Washington, ranks Saudi Arabia among the 11 least free nations in the world, giving the country a score of 10 out of 100 on its Freedom Index, below Iran's 17. Some of the other countries whose leaders will meet with Mr. Trump on Sunday also have less than sterling human rights records, including Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar. Michael J. Abramowitz, the president of Freedom House, said, "We are very glad that Secretary Tillerson called out Iran for its egregious failures to respect free speech and free association." He added, "We should be holding all countries in the region to account for such violations, including his hosts. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran are among the world's most oppressive regimes when it comes to fundamental freedoms." Mr. Trump is hardly the first president to view human rights through a selective lens. Mr. Obama and President George W. Bush often spoke of the importance of encouraging other governments to guarantee basic rights, but played down that message when it might have conflicted with other interests. Mr. Obama, for instance, negotiated an agreement with Iran to limit its nuclear program and reopen diplomatic relations with Cuba after more than a half-century without making human rights an impediment to a deal. Mr. Trump, however, has shown a seeming affinity for strongman leaders like Mr. Sisi, President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey and President Vladimir V. Putin of Russia. In an interview during the campaign last year, he indicated that he would not presume to tell them what to do at home. "I don't know that we have a right to lecture," he said. "Just look about what's happening with our country." A measure of Mr. Trump's approach will come on Sunday when he delivers what aides have called the centerpiece speech of his trip at a ceremony in Riyadh to introduce a new center for combating extremism. The goal, aides said, is not to lecture, but to suggest a way forward for nations that have served as incubators for radicalism to instead stand together against it. The speech, Lieutenant Gen. H.R. McMaster, the president's national security advisor, said before leaving Washington, is intended to unite the broader Muslim world against common enemies of all civilization and to demonstrate America's commitment to our Muslim partners. Continue reading the main story.